China is going to hold the 20th Party Congress later this year. Is there any doubt that you think Xi Jinping is going to get the third term?
I think this is part of the Chinese Communist leadership sizing up the Biden administration to try and determine how they would react if China put pressure on Taiwan, for example. Certainly in the first year of the Biden administration, despite some tough campaign rhetoric, there's been very little to deal with things China's been doing in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, domestically repressing the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, eliminating the one country, two systems regime in Hong Kong, a whole series of things like that. So it's, I think, the assessment that Xi is trying to make is whether Biden would stand up if China exerted pressure in the Indo-Pacific. And I'm sure he's got that in mind as he faces the next party Congress. But unless I miss my guess, most of his enemies have been removed from senior positions in the Communist Party. I think there are many other challenges because I don't think China is nearly as stable domestically as some people would like the rest of the world to believe. I think the problems are growing. An aging population, economic instability, parts of the country that are still unhappy being ruled from Beijing. The Taiwan problem remains. And in any authoritarian regime, there are nonetheless struggles for control. So, but in the near term, I think Xi is very much in control, and I think that'll be reaffirmed.
Will China become a more dangerous opponent for the U.S. when Xi Jinping continues to be China's leader after 10 years in power? What's the grand strategy the U.S. should have to deal with China, especially with the war in Ukraine as a reference?
Well, I think China does have a grand strategy. I think you see many aspects of it, and it covers the full range of activity from economic matters to political to military. And I think its near-term objectives are clearly to establish hegemony in the Indo-Pacific, to become a global power, and ultimately to overtake the United States as the most powerful country in the world. So the immediate objectives for the United States are to try to deal with issues that have gone largely unnoticed for many years. The theft of intellectual property by the Chinese state-owned enterprises, that's been an enormous contribution to China's ability to undercut its competitors in international economics, the manipulation of the World Trade Organization, the unfair competition that China exerts through subsidies and preferential financing for Chinese state-owned enterprises, and a whole range of economic policies that are not consistent with the free market, and in particular using Chinese companies as agents of the state for politico-military purposes, like Huawei and ZTE, which are not simply telecommunications companies. They're intended to get control of international telecommunications, not simply for economic benefit, but for the benefit of intelligence gathering and influence operations. China has dramatically scaled up its military expenditures. Over the years, it's increasing its ballistic missile capability. It's got some of the best cyber warfare operations in the world. It really, across the whole spectrum of military power, China has been building up, and the United States and the West as a whole have not been paying attention. So these are all issues that I think the war in Ukraine now highlights, as people recognize that that although there's a war in Europe, which has woken up the Europeans, that it's all not sweetness and light around the world, the real focus for the rest of the 21st century will be in the Indo-Pacific. So to the extent that the U.S. can alert Europe to what Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, India, Australia, Southeast Asia already know, I think that will help get a more unified response to China. But that also goes back to reinforcing the Russian-Chinese entente, because as Russia is isolated from Europe now, isolated from the West, it doesn't have much of an option other than to turn to China.
Some people in Taiwan, they have raised concerns about Taiwan might be the next Ukraine under China's decades-long ambition. Do you see the imminent danger of China's invasion into Taiwan?
I don't see it as, I don't see China imminently invading Taiwan. In fact, I think in their preference in Beijing, they don't want to have to fight to get Taiwan. They don't want to inherit an island that's full of destruction. They don't want to see Taiwan's productive capabilities, chip manufacturing facilities or industry or the Kaohsiung port or really any of the enormous amount of economic productivity on Taiwan impaired. They want the island the way it is now. They just want it under Beijing's control. So the preferred way to accomplish that is not to invade, but to confront Taiwan with circumstances that make it impossible for the United States to aid Taiwan, to find an American leader who won't defend Taiwan, who won't respond to Chinese threats, and that leave the government in Taiwan with no option. Now, China has tried this before in the late 1990s. Even the Bill Clinton administration responded very strongly by sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups toward the Taiwan Strait, and China backed down. I don't think Xi Jinping wants to do this at great risk, because if he tried to confront Taiwan and the United States in a way that the United States did not back down, that could be threatening to Xi Jinping's regime. So he wants to act when he feels that he's not gambling, when the outcome is closer to a certainty. And I don't think that's where we are. I don't think the Biden administration is terribly strong, but I think Taiwan's support in Congress and among the American people is overwhelming. And I think that would be made very clear. So at this point, I think China is still trying to absorb the lessons that we're all learning about Ukraine, to see how the United States continues to react, and will then base future policy on that. At the same time, I think the United States should take more steps now to show Beijing that we have passed by the period of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan, that we do not interpret the phrase one China to mean what Beijing means, that one China in the Shanghai Communique was never conceded by the United States to mean Taiwan under Beijing's control. And in fact, many basic elements of the Shanghai Communique now no longer apply. And I've said for over 20 years now that the United States should grant full diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, exchange ambassadors and all the rest. And if China doesn't like that, well, that's just too bad, because we're recognizing reality, which is usually a pretty good place to rest your foreign policy. I think it's the right thing for the United States to do. The people of Taiwan have demonstrated they're fully capable of a democratic society with a wide, very robust political debate. They have a free economy, and they've been responsible in their conduct in world affairs. So I think as the United States works to bring South Korea, Japan, Australia, India into closer alignment to deal with the threat from the government in Beijing, that Taiwan is going to have to be a part of this. I mean, I think in Japan today, for example, people understand that a Chinese attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan. And new president is coming in South Korea. I think this is something that the U.S. needs to discuss with him as well. So it's very complicated. It's a dangerous world in the Indo-Pacific, but it's time now to try and work together with our friends to avoid this problem getting worse. The temptation is always to say, well, look, it's not so bad, we don't want to make it worse. We shouldn't do anything that anybody could take the wrong way. But I think Xi Jinping would read that as a sign of weakness. I think he can be deterred. I think Vladimir Putin could have been deterred from invading Ukraine. And our failure to do that may be read in Beijing as a sign of weakness. I don't think that's where the U.S. is. I think we're going to have a presidential election in 2024. It's a long way away. But where the American people are, I think, is that they still favor the peace through strength policies of Ronald Reagan, even if some of their leaders don't. So that, I think, is we're going to see the political debate in the U.S. on that subject over the next several years. Well, I hope people understand that the failure to deter Vladimir Putin is something that we need to examine to avoid it happening again in other places. It's true that we've put very severe sanctions on Russia, but that shouldn't make us satisfied that, well, it's true that Russia invaded Ukraine, but we're imposing sanctions. We're not happy with that situation. What we wanted, what we failed to do was stop the invasion to begin with. So I hope that one lesson America draws from this with respect to Taiwan is that the structures of deterrence that we have, while they're good as far as they go, need to be strengthened even more. That's one reason to recognize Taiwan as an independent country, to show that the United States understands it's not a lost dependency of China.
You were UN ambassador in Bush administration. What is your evaluation about the function or dysfunction of the UN? Another matter of fact is that China has been quite successful in expanding its influence in the UN and its various organizations. How meaningful is UN in today's world when Russia and China behaves less than responsibly?
Yeah. Well, the UN is a huge organization. That's part of its problem. It tries to do too many things. In the Ukraine crisis, the agencies that are right now performing important work are the humanitarian agencies like the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, the World Food Program, the UNICEF, the last two being headed by Americans. That's the traditional role. And they provide, should provide humanitarian assistance on a non-political basis. And so their work is very important. What's broken at the UN are the political decision-making bodies. The Security Council is broken. The General Assembly is broken. The UN Human Rights Council is broken. And Ukraine demonstrates that very clearly. The 5 major powers, the permanent members of the Security Council, have vetoes that protect them, as in Ukraine's case, Russia, from bearing any responsibility for their conduct. And some would say, well, that's a basic problem with the UN itself. It was a basic problem during the Cold War, which is one reason the UN essentially collapsed. There was a brief period when the Soviet Union dissolved that people thought, well, maybe now it will perform as the framers imagined it would. That has obviously not happened, and so I don't really see any prospect in coming major issues dealing with China or Russia where the UN political bodies will have any significant role at all.